Chapter Before the beginning, who were first humans? When we speak of the first humans, we are not speaking of a single moment, a day, a year, or even a century, when something unmistakably human appeared on Earth, Earth, for the first time. Human origins are a process, not an event. They unfolded across millions of years in the grasslands, forests, and margins of Africa. Climate, ecology, competition, and the slow accumulation of biological changes that eventually produce the animal that would alter the planet more profoundly than any that had come before. The genus Homo, the category of primates all humans belong, appears in the fossil record approximately to 3 million years ago in Africa. The earliest members of this genus, including Homo habilis and the related Australopithecus species that preceded them, were substantially different from modern humans in brain size, body proportions, and annual behavioral complexity. They were upright walkers, which freed their hands for carrying and manipulating objects. Their cognitive abilities and their technological repertoire were modest compared to what would develop over the following millions of years. By approximately 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern, had appeared in Africa. The oldest known fossils of our species, from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, date to a pre-human and Transatine Kausago, and show a combination of modern and an archaic features. Reminds us how gradual the transition to our own form was. These early members of our species were not yet behaviorally modern in all respects. The full, though flowering of symbolic thought, long-distance trade, and complex social organization came later. But they were the ancestors from all living humans descend. The world into which early humans were born was not the stable, predictable environment we might imagine. The Pleistocene epoch, which lasted from approximately 2.5 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago, was characterized by biomatic oscillations between glacial periods, ice ages, and warmer interglacials. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of meters. Landscapes that were forests became grassland and then desert. The distribution of animals that early humans depended on for food changed constantly. Survival in this shifting world required a flexibility and adaptability that would become the defining characteristic of our species. Chapter African Cradle. Landscapes of survival. For most of human evolutionary history, Africa was both the birthplace and the primary arena of human adaptation. The continent's extraordinary ecological diversity, from the tropical rainforests of the Congo Basin to the open savannas, Tia Sofan of the Serengeti, from the great Valleys lakes and wetlands to the coastal cliffs and tide pools of the southern Cape, presented early humans with a range of environments that demanded and rewarded versatility. The humans who could exploit multiple ecological zones were the ones most likely to survive when any single environment became hospitable. The Great Rift Valley of East Africa, stretching from the Afar Triangle in the north to Mozambique in the south, was particularly important in human evolution. This geological feature, created by the separation of tectonic plates, exposed ancient sediments, preserved a remarkable fossil record, and the mosaic of habitat. Lake margins, riverine forests, grasslands, and volcanic highlands, all within walking distance of one another, provided early humans with access to diverse food resources. The ecological challenges that may have in the devolved brains and more flexible behaviors. The southern tip of Africa, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet along coastline of rocky tidal pools and sandy beaches, played a particularly important role in the story of human survival during periods of climatic stress. Sites like Pinnacle Point and Blombos Cave in South Africa preserve evidence of human occupation dating to more than 160,000 years ago, when the interior of Africa may have been too arid to support large populations. These coastal populations survived by exploiting reliable protein resources of the sea. Shellfish, fish, seals, and seabirds, and their descendants may have preserved the continuity of our species through one of the most difficult environmental periods in human history. The idea that a small population of humans along the African coast may have served as the ancestral population from which all living humans descend, sometimes called the coastal hypothesis, remains scientifically debated. But the evidence that humans were exploiting marine and coastal resources far earlier than previously thought is well established. The shellfish middens, evidence of ochre processing, and the early engraved geometric patterns found that sites like Blombos suggest that the people who lived on this coast were not only surviving, but beginning to engage in the symbolic and social behaviors that would eventually characterize fully modern human culture. Chapter: Food, the Endless Search. For most of human history, finding enough food to sustain life was the central occupation of daily existence. Early humans were omnivores, among the most flexible feeders in the animal kingdom. This dietary flexibility was one of the primary foundations of their survival success, where other large mammals were specialists, as depended on specific food sources that could disappear with changing seasons or shifting environments. Early humans could shift between plant foods, animal foods, between terrestrial and aquatic resources, and between the products of different ecological zones, with a facility that gave them an enormous adaptive advantage. Plant foods formed the foundation of early human diets across most environments and seasons. Roots and undergrowths were storage organs, autarky, and because they were available year-round, even in environments where above-ground plant foods were seasonal. The ability to dig for these resources using sharpened sticks, bones, or eventually stone tools gave early humans access to a calorie-rich food source that was largely unknowable to animals that lacked manipulative hands and the cognitive ability to understand that edible resources could be hidden underground. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest that tubers and other underground storage may have provided the majority of dietary calories in many African environments throughout the year. Fruits, seeds, nuts, and other above-ground plant foods were consumed quantities when new available and contributed important micronutrients to the early human diet. The geographic knowledge required to exploit these resources efficiently was considerable. Understanding where different plant species grew, when they would bear fruit, how to process species that were nutritious but required treatment to remove toxins or improve digestibility was a body of ecological knowledge that had to be learned and transmitted across generations. This knowledge was not instinct, it was culture, and the groups that accumulated it and maintained it most effectively were the ones most likely to survive lean seasons. Animal foods, meat, arrow eggs, insects, and the products of aquatic environments provided the high-quality protein and fat that human brains and bodies require, and that plant foods alone cannot supply in sufficient quantities. The acquisition of animal foods to multiple forms depending on the environment and the technology available. Early human sites in Africa preserve evidence of both scavenging, the opportunistic exploitation of animals killed by other predators, and hunting. The distinction between scavenging and hunting is important because it requires different cognitive and technological capabilities. An evidence suggests that early humans were initially more dependent on scavenging and small game hunting, before gradually developing the cooperative hunting strategies and projectile technologies that allowed them to large game. Insects were a food source of enormous importance throughout human evolutionary history, though they are often overlooked in accounts of early human diet. Termites, caterpillars, beetle larvae, and various other insects are nutritionally dense, seasonally available in enormous quantities in tropical Africa, and require no specialized technology to collect. The cracking of termite mounds, a behavior observed in chimpanzees and early human tool users, and the collection of swarming insects during breeding season would have provided reliable protein supplements throughout the year. The global reduction in insect consumption that has accompanied the development of agricultural societies presents a departure from a dietary pattern characterized Murray history. Chapter Fire, the technology changed everything. Among all the technologies that early humans developed, none was more transformative than the controls of fire. Fire provided warmth against cold, protection against predators, light in the darkness, and importantly, a means of cooking food that fundamentally altered the relationship between humans and their diet, with consequences that reached into the deepest levels of human biology, social organization, and cognitive development. The question of when hominins first began controlling fire is one of the most debated in paleoanthropology, and the evidence is genuinely difficult to interpret. Burned bones and evidence of fire use at sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa date to approximately 1 million years ago, suggesting that Homo erectus, the species that preceded modern humans, was using fire long before Homo sapiens appeared. Some researchers have proposed even dates based on burned material at other sites, though these claims are more contested. What is clear is that by the time anatomically modern humans present in Africa, fire was already a well-established part of the human technological repertoire. Cooking transformed human diet in ways significance is difficult to overstate. Heat breaks down the cellular walls of plant foods, making their starches more digestible and significantly increasing the caloric yield that the human body can extract from a given quantity of food. It destroys many plant toxins that would otherwise make certain foods inedible. It makes meat safer to eat by killing pathogens, and softens tough animal foods like sinew and cartilage into forms that can be more efficiently processed. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued that the adoption of cooking fundamentally changed human biology, reducing the size of the gut required for processing raw food, increasing the energy available for brain growth, and altering the social organization of human groups. By creating hearth as a focal point for food sharing, fire's role in protection from predators was profound and immediate. The African savanna is and remains a landscape populated by large carnivores, including lions, leopards, slugs, hyenas, and wild dogs, all of which serious threats to early humans. A fire maintained through the night at a campsite created a protective barrier that carnivores were reluctant to cross, allowing of humans to sleep with a degree of security that would have been impossible without it. This protection was not merely physical, the psychological security of the firelit camp, the ability to sleep more deeply and more completely, would have had significant effects on human health and cognitive function. Over time, the social effects of fire of care and cooking may have been among its most consequential long-term currents into human evolution. The hearth, the fire around which food was cooked and shared, became the focal point of early human social life, gathering around a fire to eat, to tell stories, to maintain social bonds, and to plan cooperative activities created a social structure agnostic among human primates. The cooking fire enforced a kind of temporal discipline. Food had to be prepared. There was a specific time and place for eating, and a social reciprocity. The person who tended the fire benefited others, and the expectation of sharing was embedded in the social logic of the campfire. This daily gathering and sharing around the fire may have been worked foundations in the co-operations of operations, social cooperation that distinguishes human societies from those of other primates. Chapter V. Tools, hands, stone, and the extended mind. The creation and use of tools is not unique to humans. Chimpanzees use sticks to extract termites. Crows fashion hooks from wire, and a variety of other animals modify objects to extend their physical capabilities. What distinguishes human tool use is its cumulative complexity. Each generation inherits the tool-making knowledge of the previous one, improves upon it, and passes the improved version on. This ratchet effect, in which a technological knowledge emulates time rather than being reinvented in each generation, is as walled human technology to advance from simple stone flakes to nuclear reactors over the course of millions of years. The oldest unambiguous stone tools in the archaeological record are the Oldowan tools, named for the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were first described. These tools date to approximately 2.5 to 3 million years ago, and consist of slakes, staphylines, from which the flakes were removed. They are not impressive objects by any modern standard. A casual observer might mistake them for naturally rocks, but they represent a cognitive and physical achievement of genuine significance. Making an Oldowan tool requires understanding the fracture properties of stone, selecting appropriate raw materials, and applying controlled force at the correct angle and with the correct intensity. Experiments have shown that learning to make these tools reliably takes considerable practice. The Acheulean tool tradition, which emerged approximately 1.5 million years ago is primarily with Homo erectus, introduced a new level of complexity in intention and manufacture. The characteristic Acheulean artifact is the hand axe, a large teardrop-shaped tool bifacially flaked to a symmetrical form. The symmetry of Acheulean and Azcan as the subject of considerable discussion among archaeologists, because achieving symmetry requires working toward the ornamental template. An idea of what the finished tool should look like before the stone has been shaped. This forward planning, this ability to hold a goal in mind and work systematically toward it, is a cognitive capability that marked an important development in hominin mental evolution. The Middle Stone Age of Africa and the Middle Paleolithic of Europe, dating to 300,000 to 40,000 years ago, the development of more sophisticated, good tool-making techniques that required multiple steps of preparation before the Vidu de Leverloi technique for Emure involved carefully preparing a stone core into a specific shape so that a flake of predetermined form could be struck from it in a single blow. The preparation of the core was itself a complex operation that might require removing dozens of smaller flakes before the desired final flake could be obtained. This kind of extended, multi-step planning, working through a sequence of operations toward a distant goal, represents a cognitive sophistication that is qualitatively different from simple flake production. Tools were not only made from stone, bone, antler, shell, wood, and plant fiber were all used tool materials by early humans. Though the organic materials are preserved far less frequently than stone in the archaeological record, evidence of hafting, attaching stone points to wooden shafts to create spears, arrows, appears by at least 300,000 years ago. Compound tools of this kind, which combine materials into a single functional object, require planning, adhesive technology, and the ability to conceive of a tool as a system of components rather than a single element. The bow and arrow, which appears in the African archaeological record by approximately 70,000 years ago, presents the culmination of this compound tool logic introduced by Dr. Thiley of devastating effectiveness. Chapter Feast Shelter, making space in the wild. The construction of shelter is so fundamental to human life in most environments that we tend to take it for granted. But for early humans in environments for protection from rain, cold, and predators was a daily necessity. The ability to create and improve shelters was a critical survival skill. The evidence for early human shelter construction is fragmentary. Organic materials decay, leaving little trace. But what survives points to a long history of increasingly sophisticated approaches to the problem of creating a safe, weatherproof space in a landscape that provided no such thing. The most accessible form of natural shelter available to early humans was rock overhangs and caves, and the archaeological record is heavily biased toward these sites. Precisely, stone preserves evidence far better than open-air sites. Caves and rock shelters like those at Pinnacle Point, Blombos, and Clancy's River mouth in South Africa, at Casa and School in Israel, and at dozens of other sites around the world, provide the densest archaeological records of early human occupation, with stratified deposits that allow researchers to read the story of repeated occupation across thousands of years. These sites were not always continuous occupied. They were used when environmental conditions made them attractive and abandoned when conditions changed. But they represent the first evidence of humans selecting and repeatedly returning to specific places as home bases. Open-air campsites with the protection of rock overhangs required for the construction of windbreaks ends, and the evidence for these is rare but compelling. At Terra Amata, near Nice in France, excavations revealed oval arrangements of post hollows dating to approximately 400,000 years ago, suggesting simple hut structures. At Ohelo II in Israel, dated to approximately 23,000 years ago, the remains of 6 brush hut floors were preserved by waterlogging, giving a remarkably clear picture of a seasonal campsite with multiple sleeping and activity areas. These early constructed shelters demonstrate the ability to modify the environment to meet human needs rather than simply finding natural spaces that happen to serve human purposes. The choice of campsite location was itself a survival skill, requiring sophisticated environmental knowledge. A good campsite offered multiple advantages simultaneously: proximity to water, access to food recesses, defensible position against predators, appropriate exposure to sun and wind for warmth and dryness, and sufficient visual range to detect approaching threats. Reading the landscape for these qualities required the accumulated knowledge of many generations and the ability to predict future conditions. Knowing that particular hillside would be sheltered from winter winds, that a particular valley would flood seasonally, that a particular tree line indicated the presence of water as humans expanded into colder environments during and after the migration out of Africa. Shelter construction became even more critical to survival in the frigid environments of Ice Age Europe. Could be fatal within hours. The elaborate mammoth bone structures found at sites like Mazyrik and Mezin in Ukraine, dated to approximately 15,000 years ago, demonstrate that late Pleistocene humans in cold environments had developed sophisticated construction skills and were investing significant labor in the creation of substantial, semi-permanent dwellings. The circular structures at these sites, with floors several meters in diameter, walls from carefully interlocked mammoth bones, and probable roof coverings of hides, present a level of architectural planning and communal effort that required not only technical skill but organized social cooperation. Chapter Feds. Clothing, the second skin. The adoption of clothing was not merely a response to cold. It was a technological innovation that fundamentally expanded the range of environments that humans could inhabit. Without clothing, the human body is adapted to warm, relatively humid climates. With clothing, humans can survive in some of the most extreme thermal environments on Earth, from the frozen Arctic to the high-altitude deserts of the Tibetan Plateau. Understanding and how early humans developed clothing is consequently not merely a question of central importance to the story of human dispersal across the globe. Direct evidence for early clothing is almost non-existent. Organic materials, hides and plant fibers decay rapidly, and the oldest surviving textile dials date to only about 30,000 years ago. The archaeological evidence for clothing must therefore be indirect, drawn from the tools used in its production, from genetic analysis of the parasites that live in clothing, and from the geographic distribution of early humans in environments where clothing would have been necessary for survival. Bone needles, thin, delicate implements used to sew skins together. In the archaeological record by at 40,000 years ago in Europe and Asia, and some researchers believe needles were in use much earlier. The existence of needles implies the production of tailored clothing, since skins tied or draped around the body do not require sewing. A remarkable and unexpected line of evidence for the decay of clothing comes from the genetics of lice. Human body lice, which live in clothing rather than on the body, are a distinct population from head lice. By analyzing the genetic divergence between body lice and head lice, researchers have estimated the date at which the two populations separated, which would respond roughly to the date which clothing became sufficient regular use to support a Laspeliston that had shifted its habitat from hair fabric. These genetic studies have suggested that clothing lice freeburged lice somewhere between 40,000 and 170,000 years ago. with most estimates clustering around 70 to 100,000 years ago. This suggests that clothing was in use, at least in some populations, well before the expansion out of Africa. The processing of animal hides into wearable clothing required a series of tools and techniques whose mastery was itself a significant technological achievement. Fresh hides must be cleaned of fat and flesh, treated to prevent decay, worked to softness, and eventually cut and assembled. The stone scrapers found in large numbers at Paleolithic and Middle Stone Age sites are interpreted by most archaeologists as hide-working tools used to scrape fat from animal surfaces skins. Evidence of ochre use, the red iron used, the red unoxide pigment, found many early human sites include a hide processing function. Since ochre has preservative properties when rubbed into skin, though its primary significance was almost certainly symbolic. In Arctic and subarctic environments, the development of truly effective cold weather clothing was a survival prerequisite, and the sophistication of clothing technology in these environments reflects the intensity of the selective pressure that cold imposed. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic independently developed multi-layer clothing systems with an inner layer of caribou skin or fur skin worn fur side and against the body, and an outer layer of caribou or seal or skin worn fur side out, creating an insulating air layer between them. The tailored design of these garments, with fitted hoods, wrist cuffs, and ankle closures that minimized heat loss at the body's extremities, represents a pinnacle of functional clothing engineering that modern synthetic obligure attempt to replicate. Chapter Water. Finding the source of life. Water, the most fundamental requirement of human survival. A human being can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. And the search for reliable water sources shaped the movements, the settlement patterns, and the social organization of early human groups in ways that are visible in the archaeological record. Understanding how early humans found, accessed, stored, and sometimes traveled to obtain water is essential to understanding how they survived in environments that ranged from the permanently wet rainforest to the hyper-arid desert. In most environments inhabited by early humans, surface water, rivers, lakes, springs, and seasonal streams provided the primary water supply. The distribution of early human sites in the archaeological record correlates well with distribution of water sources, and the paths that hunter-gatherer groups traveled were often organized around the locations of reliable water. In Africa, the Great Rift Valley lakes, Turkana, Tanganyika, Malawi, and others acted both the Limultimopula and populations, early humans hunted and scavenged, and the human population dwindles who depended on those animals. The shores of these lakes preserved some of the richest concentrations of early human fossils and artifacts in the world. In semi-arid and arid environments, the knowledge of where to found water, including subsurface water sources that were not visible at the surface, was among the most critical survival knowledge that a group could possess. Desert-adapted hunter-gatherer peoples like the San of the Kalahari have traditionally used a variety of techniques to access subsurface water, digging in dry riverbeds, inserting tubes into the sand to draw water from depths below the surface, knowing which plants indicate the presence of underground water and how to access the water stored in their roots or bulbs. The Tama melon and the bulb of the Kalahari, for example, stored large quantities of water in their roots and were critical water sources for sand hunters far from permanent water. This kind of environmental knowledge passed across generations rooted a form of ecological intelligence that was as important to survival as any physical tool. The transport of water, carrying it from its source to a campsite or processing location, required containers, and the development of watertight containers was a significant technological achievement. The earliest containers were almost certainly the shells of large mollusks, the stomachs and bladders of large mammals, the rinds, certain fruits and gourds. And the evidence for their use is largely invisible in the archaeological record. The earliest clearly artificial water containers are pottery vessels dating to approximately 20,000 years ago in China and Japan, but the use of organic containers for water transport almost certainly began much earlier. Ostrich eggshells are washed watertight and hold approximately 1 liter of water. Water were used as waters by southern African hunter-gatherers have been found at archaeological sites dating to more than 660,000 years ago, sometimes far from the nearest ostrich habitat, indicating they were deliberately carried over considerable distances. Springs and seeps, places where groundwater emerges at the surface, were particularly valued because they provided reliable water in environments where surface water was seasonal or absent. Early humans showed considerable skill in finding these features. Often occur at geological boundaries, places where permeable and impermeable rock layered meet that require reading the landscape for subtle signs, the accumulation of game tracks, the presence of moisture indicating hang vegetation, and the specific terrain features that predict the occurrence of springs were all part of the environmental knowledge base foragers accumulated and transmitted. Some spring sites in southern Africa owe evidence. Humid human occupation stretching back tens of thousands of years, testifying to their long-term importance as water sources in otherwise dry environments. Chapter AX. Social life. The survival of the group. No single individual, no matter how skilled, how knowledgeable, or how physically capable, can survive alone indefinitely in the environments that early humans inhabited. Human survival has always been fundamentally social. The group was the unit of survival, and the social bonds, cooperative behaviors, and information-sharing networks that held groups together were the importance of revival. As any physical technology, understanding early human social life is consequently not a luxury of archaeological curiosity, but an essential element of understanding how our species persisted and eventually flourished. The basic social unit of most hunter-gatherer societies, as observed in ethnographic studies, is the band, a group of between 15 and 50 individuals who move together through a shared territory, cooperate in food acquisition and child rearing, and maintain close social ties based on a combination of kinship and choice. These bands are not isolated. They maintain regular social contact with neighboring bands and exchange marriage partners to create alliances and prevent inbreeding, share information about resource locations, and occasionally aggregate into larger gatherings of several hundred individuals at times when resources are concentrated enough to support a temporary increase in group size. Cooperation in food acquisition was one of the most important forms of social behavior in early human groups, and impotence developed the capacity. Large game animals, a single human hunter pursuing a large ungulate like a wildebeest or a bison, faces long odds. The animal is faster, stronger, far more capable of inflicting injury than the hunter. A coordinated group of hunters able to surround and drive an animal, to chase it into traps or overts, or to wear it down through persistence hunting over many hours, days, has a very different probability of success. The cognitive requirements of coordinated group hunting, the ability to communicate plans, to coordinate movements in real time, and to anticipate both the animal's behavior and the actions of other hunters, are substantial, and the development of this capacity was both a driver and a product of increased social complexity. The care of the young and the old was another fundamental dimension of early human cooperation. Human infants are born in a uniquely helpless state, more helpless than the young of any other primate, and require years of intensive care before they can fend for themselves. In a foraging lifestyle, a mother carrying an infant and caring for a toddler while also finding enough food as sustain herself and her children is operating at the extreme edge of her physical and cognitive capacity. The help of other group members, grandmothers, older siblings, fathers, and other community members was not optional but essential. The grandmother hypothesis in evolutionary anthropology proposes that the post-reproductive lifespan of human females, unique among primates, evolved specifically because grandmothers who helped provision their daughters' offspring increased the survival of those grandchildren, thereby passing on the genes that enabled post-reproductive longevity. Information sharing was perhaps the most fundamentally important form of social cooperation in early human groups. The body of knowledge required to survive in any given environment, where food sources were located at different seasons, what environmental science predicted weather changes, which plants were edible and which were toxic, how to make and repair the tools required for daily life, which neighboring groups were friendly and which were dangerous, was too large and complex to be acquired by individual experience in a single lifetime. It had to be transmitted from generation to generation. Through demonstration, through story, and through accumulated cultural practices of the groups with more effective information transmission, better language, stronger teaching traditions, larger social networks, had access to larger bodies of survival villain knowledge, and were consequently better equipped to survive. Chapter 6: Language Communication. The invisible tool. Language is the most powerful survival tool early humans possessed, and unlike stone tools or fire, it left almost no direct trace in the archaeological record. We cannot excavate a sentence or carbon date a word. The evidence for the evolution of language must be assembled indirectly from the anatomy of fossilized skulls and hyoid bones, from the genetic analysis of genes associated with speech and language processing, from the cognitive demands of behaviors that appear in the archaeological record, and from the logic of what would have been necessary to coordinate the increasingly complex social behaviors that the physical prerequisites of spoken language: a descended larynx, a flexible tongue, precise control of the muscles of the mouth and throat, and the neural architecture to process rapid sequences of sounds were present in anatomically modern humans, and in at least some archaic humans who preceded us. The FOXP-TT gene associated with the fine motor control of the speech apparatus and with aspects of language processing is shared in its modern human form with Neanderthals, suggesting some form of complex vocal communication predates the separation of our two lineages, approximately 4 to 500,000. This does not prove that Neanderthals had language in the full modern sense, but it is consistent with the possibility language enabled early humans to do something that no other animal could do, to share detailed information about the past and the future, about places they were not currently in, about events that had not yet occurred, and about entities that not physically exist. This capacity for what linguists call displacement, the ability to refer to things not present in the immediate environment, was transformative for survival. A hunter who encountered a new kind of trap or herbivores, animals, seasonal movement, pet p, to others who'd not written a creep, could hunt before between. Knowledge about resource locations could be shared between groups who visited different territories. The dead could be remembered and their knowledge preserved after their deaths. Beyond its practical utility, the medium through which early human social bonds were created and maintained, anthropological research on contemporary hunter-gatherer societies consistently finds that a very large proportion of daily speech is devoted not to coordination but to social management, the discussion of relationships, the sharing of gossip, the negotiation of status and alliance, the expression of emotion. This social use of language, which the evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar has associated the need to maintain large social networks in the absence of the physical grooming that serves this function in other primates, may have been as important to early human survival as any of its practical applications. Groups with stronger social bonds were better cooperators, and better cooperators had higher survival rates. The development of narrative, the ability to tell stories with complex temporal structure, multiple characters, and causal chains, was particularly important for the transmission of survival knowledge across generations and between groups. A story about how a hunter avoided a lion, how a group found water in a drought, or how certain plants caused illness could convey practical information in a form that was memorable, emotionally engaging, and culturally portable in ways that simple propositional statements could not achieve. The oral traditions of hunter-gatherer peoples are rich with exactly this kind of pride of practical ecological and social knowledge encoded in narrative form. And there is every reason to believe that this tradition of narrative knowledge transmission extends back to the earliest period of fully modern language. Chapter 2: Hunting Strategies of the Predator. The image of early humans as hunters, brave, bold pursuers of large game across the open savanna, is one of the most enduring and popular accounts of human prehistory, and it contains genuine truth alongside considerable distortion. Early humans were hunters, and their hunting abilities developed over time them into something genuinely remarkable. But hunting was one element within a broader foraging strategy that included gathering, scavenging, fishing, and nixon, and of small animals, and the emphasis placed on large game. Hunting in popular accounts has tended to obscure the diversity and flexibility of early human food acquisition. Persistence hunting, the pursuit of animals over long distances until they overheat and collapse, is one of the most ancient and distinctively human hunting strategies. Exploiting a physical capability that Homo sapiens possesses to a degree unmatched by any other large mammal. Humans are unique among primates in being adapted for long-distance running. Our long legs, short toes, enlarged gluteal muscles, ability to dissipate heat through sweating, and reduced body hair all contribute to a running physiology that allows us cover very long distances at moderate speeds. In the heat of the African day, when most quadrupeds must stop periodically to pant and cool down, maintain continuous movement, following the tracks of an exhausted animal until it can no longer run. The San people of southern Africa practiced a hunt insensate, and their accounts of these hunts, which could last 4 to 8 hours across distance to 35 kilometers, give a vivid picture of a technology that required not advanced weaponry, but advanced physiology, tracking skill, and endurance. Ambush hunting, concealment, and surprise to get within striking distance of prey, was another fundamental hunting strategy that required detailed knowledge of animal behavior and movement patterns, patience, and the ability to coordinate with other hunters. Early hunting weapons, wooden spears, stoned spears, and eventually bows and arrows were most effective at relatively short range, making the ability to approach animals without being detected essential. Understanding the wind direction that would carry a human scent toward an alert animal, knowing the daily movement patterns of a specific species, and selecting appropriate concealment. All of these were skills that required years of observation and practice to develop. Cooperative hunting, in which of hunters coordinated their movements to surround, drive, or grave ambush game, dramatically increased the efficiency of large game hunting and the size of animal that could be targeted. Drive hunting, in which groups of humans work together to chase animals toward natural barriers, cliff airs, prepared pitfalls, could produce harvests of multiple animals simultaneously, providing a windfall of food that exceeded the immediate consumption needs of the group and required the development of preservation. The hunting of mammoths and other megafauna in late Pleistocene Eurasia and the Americas almost certainly coordinated group efforts of considerable complexity, involving planning, communication, and division of roles that presupposed a high degree of social organization. Traps and snares represents a different kind of friend of hunting technology, one that did not require humor during the actual kill, and that could operate simultaneously multiple locations. Simple snares woven from plant fibers or rope bird could catch small mammals, birds, and reptiles mobbed with no expenditure of hunting effort beyond their initial construction and periodic checking. The development of this kind of passive hunting technology extended the effective hunting range of small group and allowed the capture of animals that would be difficult to pursue by active methods. The archaeological evidence for traps and snares is limited by the organic nature of the materials involved. Their use by hunter-gatherer peoples worldwide and the cognitive simplicity of the basic snare design suggest a very long history. Chapter Core Gathering, the overlooked foundation. In the popular imagination, the love early humans is dominated by hunting. The pursuit of large, dangerous animals across dramatic landscapes. But in most hunter-gatherer societies studied by anthropologists, gathered plant foods account for the majority of calories consumed, often 50 and 80%. In many environments and seasons, gathered foods were not merely a supplement to hunting, but the primary means of sustenance. And the women who traditionally performed most of the gathering in historical hunter-gatherers societies were often the most reliable providers of daily nutrition for their communities. The knowledge required for effective gathering was extensive and deeply ecological. A skilled gatherer needed to know not only which plants were edible, but where they grew in sufficient density to be electing when they would be available in each season, how to process them to maximize nutritional value or remove toxins, and how to read the landscape for indicators of their In the Kalahari, experienced sandwomen could identify hundreds of edible plant species and could locate underground tubers by reading subtle surface signs. A wilted stem, a slight discoloration of the soil, the specific texture of the ground that would be invisible to an untrained eye. Digging were among the most important tools in the gatherer's kit, used to excavate the tubers, roots that bulbs that formed the caloric foundation. Many hunter-gatherer diets, these simple implements, sharpened and often hardened sticks of wood, are archaeologically invisible. but their functional descendants appear in historical and ethnographic records across Africa, Australia, and other regions where gathering was a primary food acquisition strategy. The repeated use of digging sticks at productive sites would have modified the soil structure and may have had agricultural concentrating edible plants near campsites over time. Gathering was not limited to plant foods. Shellfish collecting from tidal zones was one of the most calorie-efficient and low-risk food activities of strategies available to coastal tupa populations, requiring no weapons, no specialized tools beyond simple hammers or pry sticks, and no great physical strength. The shellfish middens refuse heaps of discarded shells found at coastal sites around the world preserve a record of sustained gathering activity extending back hundreds of thousands of years. In some locations, honey was another gathered food of great importance, providing concentrated calories in a form that required skill to obtain, reading bee flight patterns to locate hives, using smoke to subdue bees, and managing the risk of stings. But that was enormously valued across all foraging societies. The seasonal and geographic knowledge that effective gathering required created a strong cognitive linkage between early human communities and their home territories. The pattern of seasonal movements of hunter-gatherer groups was not random wandering, but a carefully structured circuit organized around the predictable availability of different food resources in different places. Groups that knew their territory well, that accumulated generation of observation about where specific resources could be found in specific seasons, had an enormous survival advantage over groups that were unfamiliar with an area. This deep territorial knowledge, which included not only food resources but water sources, shelter sites, predator territories, and travel routes, was itself a form of capital, a body of information that had survival value comparable to any physical technology. Chapter 0: Medicine and Healing. Knowledge against pain. The idea that early humans lacked medical knowledge is a misconception that the archaeological and ethnobotanical evidence comprehensively contradicts. While early humans had no germ theory, no understanding of pathogens, and none of the pharmaceutical tools of modern medicine, they possessed an extensive and practically effective body of knowledge about medicinal plants, wound care, bone setting, and the management of illness that was the product of hundreds of thousands of years systematic observation and accumulation. Medicinal plant use appears to be among the oldest aspects of human culture, and its roots may extend beyond our own species. Chimpanzees self-medicate specific plant species known to have anti-parasitic properties, swallowing rough leaves, holes hold to mechanically expel intestinal parasites and consuming the bitter pith of plants with antibacterial compounds when they are ill. If our closest living relatives engage in self-medication, if early humans did not do so more extensively. The ethnobotanical record of hunter-gatherer peoples around the world documents the use of hundreds of plant species for medicinal purposes. And many of these plants have been confirmed by pharmacological analysis to contain compounds with genuine therapeutic activity. The management of wounds, which were a constant hazard of the early human lifestyle, required both practical first aid knowledge and a pharmacological toolkit. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence that early humans used a variety of plant-based preparations on wounds. Antiseptic plants whose concept puns a bit pivot, bacterial growth, astringent plants whose tannins help stop bleeding, and plants with anti-inflammatory properties. The use of clay and other mineral substances on wounds also has a long history, and some clays, clays, do have healing properties related to their mineral composition and their ability to absorb bacteria. The suturing of deep wounds, clothe them with plant, fiber thread or thorns, in an ethnographic records, and implies a level of anatomical understanding that would have required considerable practical experience. Bone fracture management was another area where early humans developed practical knowledge with genuine effectiveness. Skeletal remains from early human sites show evidence of healed fractures. Bones that were broken and then knitted back together in reasonable alignment in individuals who survived for years after the injury. Healing a major bone fracture requires immobilization of the injured limb for weeks to months, which immobile hunter-gatherer society implies that injured individuals were cared for and provisioned by their communities during a period when they could not contribute to food acquisition. The existence of healed fractures in the fossil record, therefore evidence not only of medical knowledge, but of the social commit to caring for injured and dependent community members that characterized early human social life. Dental care, in a rudimentary but real form, appears surprising early in the human record. Texts thin slivers of bone or plant material used to remove food from between teeth are documented in multiple early human populations. More remarkably, evidence of dental drilling and filling has been found at sites in Pakistan dating to approximately 9,000 years ago, and tar-based fillings appear in Neanderthal teeth from European sites. Suggests that dental pain management has a very long history. The specific plant compounds used to manage damaged dental pain by traditional healers, including compounds derived from clove, camphor and related plants often have genuine analgesic properties, reflecting sand pattern of accumulated empirical knowledge about plant pharmacology that characterizes traditional medicine systems worldwide. Chapter Third Folder and Symbol. Why Beauty Was Survival. The emergence of symbolic thought. The ability to create and communicate meaning through objects, marks, and performances that stand of things other than themselves is widely regarded as one of the most important transitions in human cognitive evolution. The archaeological evidence for this transition appears in Africa between approximately 100,000 and then 70,000 years ago. All is ago, in the form of ochre processing, shell beads, geometric engraving, and eventually hidden figurative art. Understanding why these behaviors appeared when they did, and what relationship they had to survival, requires thinking about cognition and social organization in an integrated way. Ochre, iron oxide, typically red or yellow in color, is found early human sites across Africa in quantities, forms that indicate systematic processing and use rather than accidental accumulation. Ochre has multiple potential practical uses as a component of adhesives for hafting stones to wooden shafts, as a preservative for hides, as an insect repellent, and as a sunscreen. But the quantities in which it was processed at some sites, the evidence of grinding and mixing, and its presence in symbolic contexts suggests that its primary importance was as a pigment, a material for body decoration, for marking objects, and eventually for painting on stone surfaces. The earliest unambiguous as symbolic artifacts are personal ornaments, shell beads that were strung and worn on the body, perforated shells from sites in Morocco and Israel, dating to 100,000 and to 130,000 years ago, bear the traces of red ochre and of pear patterns consistent with suspension on a cord. Personal ornaments are a most of the informational age artifacts in the archaeological record because they communicate identity, group membership, and status in ways that are visible across social distances. A person wearing specific types of beads associated with a particular group categorized a member of that group. Anyone familiar with the code, even at a distance and without verbal communication. The cave paintings and other artwork created by late Pleistocene humans in Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, and Australia represent the most specular expression early human symbolic capacity, and they raise fascinating questions about the relationship between art making and survival. The images at sites Abu Inns, dated to approximately 36,000 years ago, show imart's sophistication. The use of perspective, shading, and dynamic composition that seems to require no evolutionary development from a more primitive form. The animals depicted, horses, bison, mammoths, cave lions, rhinoceroses, were the large game animals that dominated Pleistocene landscape, and their depiction ended in such detail and with such evident care suggests that they occupied a central place in the cognitive and cultural life of the people who painted them. The social functions of symbolic culture, marking identity, communicating group membership, shared frameworks of meaning that bound communities together, had direct survival consequences. Groups that shared strong symbolic systems had greater social cohesion, better information sharing networks, and more of mechanisms by exalting conflict and maintaining cooperation. The creation of shared symbols, where paintings, ornaments, ritual performances, or visual art, creates a sense of shared identity and common membership that strengthens the social bonds on which survival cooperation depends. In this sense, art was not a luxury added to survival behavior, but an component of the social technology that made complex human cooperation possible. Chapter Gully out of Africa. The Great Dispersal. Between approximately 1,000 and 50,000 years ago, population of anatomically modern humans left Africa and began the most consequential migration in the history of our species. Within a few thousand years of this departure, the descendants of these migrants had reached the Arabian Peninsula, the Southeast Asia, and Australia. Within 20,000 years, they had expanded into East Asia and eventually across the land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska into the Americas. By approximately 15,000 years ago, modern Antarctica had colonized every continent except Antarctica, making us the most widely distributed large mammal in the history of the Earth. The timing and causes of the out-of-Africa migration are subjects of active scientific debate. The genetic evidence is clear that the primary ancestor of all non-African humans was a population that left Africa approximately 60 to 1,000 years ago, and that this migration was preceded by the dramatic expansion of modern human populations within Africa that may have followed a period of near extinction during the climatic stresses of marine isotope stage 4. Approximately 70 to 90,000 years ago. Why this particular migration was successful when earlier dispersals. There is evidence of Homo sapiens in the Levant as early as 180,000 years ago had not led to permanent colonization of Eurasia remains unclear. The routes taken by the dispersed Pampeadicing populations followed the paths of least resistance, coastlines, river valleys, and the connections between ecological zones that provided both food and water for moving groups. The southern coastal route, skirting the Indian Ocean coastline from the Horn, Africa through the Arabian Peninsula to South Asia. It's the pathway most strongly supported by genetic evidence for the initial migration. This route would have provided early migrants with a continuous ribbon of marine coastal resources. Fish, turtles, and shore birds that could sustain populations in motion without requiring adaptation. Entirely new ecological conditions. The colonization of Australia, which required a water crossing of at least 60 to 90 kilometers across open sea, even during periods of maximum glacial sea level lowering, represents one of the most remarkable survival achievements in human prehistory. Modern humans reached Australia by approximate 65,000 years ago, and their arrival required not only the construction of watercraft, but the navigation of open water. That implies sufficient social organization to plan and execute a sea voyage, sufficient maritime technology to build functional boats or rafts, and sufficient demographic pressure or exploratory to motivate the attempt. The first Australians who made this crossing were venturing into an entirely unknown world, a continent whose plants, animals, and in environments bore no resemblance to anything their ancestors had encountered. The expansion into the cold environments of northern Eurasia, and eventually into the Americas through the Siberian land bridge, a suite of adaptations, technological, social, and physiological, that took thousands of years to develop. The survival of modern humans in the Ice Age environments, Europe and Siberia, depended on fire-air management, cold weather clothing of great sophistication, hunting strategies adapted to large barge-bodied, cold-adapted megafauna, and the social organization to maintain the food stores and communal warmth required to survive long Arctic. The people who accomplished this expansion were not simply the same Trophorica foragers who had left Africa. They were populations whose technologies and knowledge had been transformed over generations. Adaptation to increasingly demanding environments. Chapter Age, Death, Burial, and the Afterlife. When humans began to mourn, the treatment of the dead is among the most philosophically significant of all human behaviors. It has not only emotional bonds with specific individuals, but a conceptual relationship with death itself, an awareness of mortality, and a desire to respond to it in culturally meaningful ways. The archaeological evidence for intentional burial and our other mortuary practices provides a window into the emotional and spiritual life of that is accessible in no other way. The oldest unambiguous evidence, intentional human burial from sites in the Middle East dating to approximately 100,000 years ago at Kafshi Cave in Israel. There remains at least 15 individuals, including infants and young adults, were found in appear to be deliberately dug graves, some with grave goods, including animal remains and red ochre, at Borıng Cave in South Africa. The burial of an infant with a perforated shell ornament, Flinty, 74,000 years ago. These burials indicate not only the people who made them were responding to death in a culturally structured way, but that they were placing objects with the dead, a behavior that implies some form of belief about the relationship between the living and the dead. Neanderthals, the archaic human population that inhabited Europe and Western Asia before and during the period of modern human expansion, also appear to have practiced intentional burial in at least some cases, though evidence is more disputed. At sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq and La Chaux de Pierce in Neanderthals, Neanderthal remains were found in positions and contexts suggesting deliberate placement. The Shanidar Ofart individual, found with concentrations of pollen around its body, whose body was initially interpreted as having been buried with flowers. A profoundly evocative image, though subsequent researchers have proposed alternate explanations for the pollen concentration. The question of Neanderthal mortuary practices remains scientifically contested, but the physical evidence of Neanderthal burials has been taken by many researchers evidence that care for the dead was not unique to our species. The elaboration of mortuary practices, from simple burial to the inclusion of grave goods, the application of pigments to bodies, and eventually the construction of elaborate burial monuments, appears to track the broader development of symbolic culture and social and complexity in early human size. As human groups became larger and more socially complex, of the dead became a more elaborate social performance, serving to communicate the status and identity of the deceased, to reinforce the bonds between the living, and to manage the social disruption that the loss of a community member. Burial goods, tools, ornaments, food offerings may reflect beliefs about an afterlife and in which these objects would be needed, or they may reflect the desire of the living to honor the dead and, in ways, communicated their value to the community. The emotional significance of death and mourning in early human communities, the grief, the sense of loss, the desire to maintain some connection with those who had died, is accessible only and indirectly through the material of burial. But it is a presence that is dead is difficult to dismiss. A parent burying an infant with a care-chosen shell ornament, a community returning to the bones of their dead to paint them with red ochre, group placing food and tools with a bottering of covering it with earth. These not the behaviors of creatures for whom the death of companions was simply neutral event. They are the behaviors of creatures who felt the loss of those they knew, who assigned meaning to death and to the relationship between the living and the dead, and responded to mortality with the same creativity and symbolic sophistication that they brought every other aspect of their lives. Chapter SETI. The Last Ice Age. Survival at the extreme between approximately 30,000 and 12,000 years ago. Earth, the last glacial maximum. The peak of the most recent ice age, when ice covered much of North America, Northern Europe, and significant portions of Asia. Sea levels were over 100 meters lower than today, and average global temperatures were approximately 6 degrees Celsius than in the pre-industrial era. For the modern humans who had by this time colonized much of the globe, the last glacial lobe represented the most severe environmental challenge since the species' origin. And the strategies they employed to survive it represent the pinnacle of Paleolithic human adaptability. In Europe, the last glacial maximum created a landscape of severe cold, roots precipitation, and dramatically altered vegetation that forced human populations into refugia, areas of relatively less severe conditions, while depopulating vast swaths of the continent. The populations that persisted in these refugia were small, genetically, coalescently, and culturally distinctive, dependent on strategies of large game hunting, communal food storage, and maximally efficient use of every available resource. The extraordinary cave art of this period, the paintings at Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, and dozens of other sites, was produced by people living on the edge of the ecologically possible, and the artistic intensity and cultural richness of this tradition suggests that the pressure of extreme environmental conditions was not suppressing human creative expression, but paradoxically intensifying it. The mammoth steppe of Siberia and Central Asia during the last glacial maximum was home to an extraordinary array of large mammals. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, hyenas, giant deer, bison, horses, and reindeer that provided both food and raw materials for the human populations, hunted them. The survival strategy of these Siberian populations was one of intensive large game hunting combined with the storage of food against the impossibly scarce winters, and the construction of the substantial semi-permanent dwellings whose remains survive at sites like Mizerix. The social organization required required to successfully hunt mammoths, animals larger than African elephants, and to maintain the cooperative networks that allowed food storage and sharing occurring across the lean months must have been sophisticated and highly developed. The peopling of the Americas, which began or shortly after the last glacial maximum through the Beringian land bridge, required the successful colonization of an entirely novel continent by populations that had never before encountered its plant and animal communities. The first Americans, whose descendants would eventually fill 2 continents, were confronting an ecological unknown of the most extreme kind. A landscape whose large mammals had never seen human hunters and were therefore unafraid of them. Plant communities required new processing techniques to exploit, and whose climate and terrain varied enormously from the tundra of Alaska to the tropical rainforests of Central America. The speed with which these first Americans adapted to and colonized their new continent, reaching the southern tip of South America within approximately 2,000 years of their initial entry, is a testament to the extraordinary adaptive flexibility that human culture and cognition had developed over hundreds of years. The end of the last glacial maximum, beginning approximately 15,000 years ago, was a single event, but a prolonged period of climatic and ecological reorganization that continued for several thousand years. The melting of the ice sheets raised sea levels, flooding the coastal areas where many human populations had been concentrated during the glacial maximum. The warming temperatures transformed grasslands into forests, eliminated the cold-adapted megafauna, the mammoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, the cave bears, on which many human populations had depended, and created the conditions for new ecological communities that required new subsistence strategies. The humans who survived this transition were those flexible enough to adapt their technologies and their social organizations to a rapidly changing world. And the strategies they developed during this period of adaptation, including eventually the management of wild plants and animals that would lead to agriculture, would transform the human story. Once more, Chapter Zerceto, the dawn of domestication, when survival became abundance. For most of the 300,000 years of Homo sapiens' existence, food was something that was found in the landscape, in the bodies of animals, in the products of wild plants. Then, beginning approximately 12,000 years ago in several locations around the world, some human populations began to take a different approach. Instead of finding food, they began to make it, the domestication of plants and animals. The transition from foraging to farming and herding was the most consequential change in human subsistence history, with consequences that reached me of human life. The shift to food production did not happen overnight.
And
It was not a simple improvement in the human condition. The earliest farmers in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, in the Yangtze and Yellow River of valleys of Hainan, in the highlands and Ngunis of New Guinea, and in the Americas, faced the challenges of a new subsistence system that was in many respects more labor-intensive and nutritionally diverse than the foraging lifestyles it replaced. Early agricultural populations show evidence of nutritional deficiencies. Reduced stature, increased tooth decay, greater prevalence of some infectious diseases compared to their foraging predecessors, reflecting the costs of a diet more narrate based on a small number of calorie-rich staple crops. The initial adoption of farming was nomming, an obvious improvement that rational people would inevitably choose. It was a strategy that paid off in the medium and long term, primarily because it supported higher population densities. The plants that became the first domesticated crops were selected, initially unconsciously and then later with increasing deliberateness, characteristics that made them more useful to humans. Larger seeds, reduced seed dispersal mechanisms that kept seeds on the plant until harvest rather than scattering them, synchronous ripening that allowed efficient harvesting, and reduced levels of the toxins and bitterness that protected wild plants against being eaten before their seeds matured. The wild ancestors of wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, and the other crops that now feed the majority of humanity bear only a limited resemblance to their modern domesticated forms, and the transformation required thousands of years of accumulated human selection, acting on naturally occurring genetic variation. The domestication of animals, sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, horses, dogs, and eventually dozens of others, provided food, fiber, and transportation, transformed the productive capacity of human societies. Dogs, domesticated from wolves by approximately 15,000 years ago, were the first domestic animal and provided early humans with hunting assistance, protection, and companionship that gave their human companions significant advantages, the hunt, and in social situations. The domestication of sheep, goats, and cattle in the Middle East, beginning approximately 10,000 years ago, provided reliable supplies, milk, and fiber that buffered agricultural communities against the crop failures that were a constant hazard of early farming. The transition to agriculture and pastoralism was the platform on which all subsequent human civilization was built. The food surpluses that farming made possible supported populations that could not all be employed in food production, creating the social space for specialization for potters, weavers, metal workers, priests, and eventually scribes, philosophers, and engineers. The settled communities that farming required recreated the conditions for the accumulation of material culture before the development of social institutions and for the kind of generational investment in infrastructure, irrigations, systems, storage facilities, defensive works that foraging lifestyles could not sustain. The long story of human survival that began with a small group of bipedal primates digging tubers on the African savanna, Havana, had arrived, after hundreds of thousands of years, at the threshold of history